Hi, we're talking about employee and employer rights and responsibilities. And today I want to talk about that from the perspective of Kantian ethics. Kant, remember, has one fundamental principle in his ethics. Informally put, we could say it comes down to this: have a good will. That's the only thing that is good without qualification. The only thing that is good no matter what. What does that really mean for us in this sort of relationship or any kind of human relationship? He gives us several different versions of the categorical imperative. He takes all to be equivalent, but to think about what this really means, we need to think about each of those formulas independently. The first one is the formula of universal law. It says, act only on that maxim you can at the same time will as universal law. There's a very closely related formula that comes just after that, called sometimes the formula of the law of nature. Act only on that maxim you could at the same time will as a universal law of nature. What's the significance of this? You have to act on the basis of principle. You can't make exceptions for yourself. You can't make exceptions for your friends or your cat. They're meowing in the background. No, you have to make exceptions for nobody. Either everybody gets an exception if they're in that situation, or nobody does. You've got to apply exactly the same rule to everyone. And so this, in part, is a formal principle of justice. Similarly situated people have to be treated similarly. You've got to apply the same rules to everyone. Now, Hegel famously said, this tells me nothing. It just says, well, act on the basis of principles, but it has no implications at all for what kind of principles I act on. If it's, kill everyone who looks at me funny, or in this case, whip any employee that doesn't do the job well, that's a terrible principle. And so we must have some way of ruling that out. Now, Kant thinks we do. Certainly he does not intend to say, all we have to do is follow the same rule for everyone, but it doesn't matter what the rule is. No, not at all. Why? Well, that's what gives him the argument to the second or third, depending on how you count them, version of the principle, the formula of humanity. It says, treat humanity in yourself or anyone else always as an end in itself and never as a means only. The significance of that is that you have to respect every moral agent, including yourself. You have to give everyone respect. Kant thinks this does follow from the formula of universal law, and here's why. He says that every rational being values, among whatever ends it happens to choose, its own rationality. What is rationality? It is the ability to use means to attain ends. Well, as a rational being, I care about attaining my ends. I want to get what I desire. I want to, let's say, improve the world or improve my own situation or whatever it is. I have certain ends. I have certain goals. And I value not only those goals, but also my ability to select among means to be able to attain my goals. In other words, something that follows from having goals that you value is valuing your ability to attain your goals. And that's rationality. So any rational being values its own rationality. That's a fundamental axiom for Kant. Rational nature exists as an end in itself, he says. So if every rational being inherently, necessarily values its own rationality, then if I'm to apply the same rule to everyone else that I apply to myself, I realize, well, I value my own rationality. I have to value everyone else's rationality. So I have to value rationality itself. I have to value people as moral agents and give them the respect I owe myself, and I think they owe me as a moral agent. You can see why Kant thinks this really ends up entailing something akin to the golden rule. Maybe not love my neighbor as myself, but at least respect my neighbor as myself. Respect their moral agency as much as I respect my own. And in his language, respect their autonomy. Well, that is an important way of thinking about this too. What if we put these together? Then we have to apply the same rules to everyone, and they better be rules that respect people's autonomy, respect their moral agency, respect their rationality. So what does that imply about the employer-employee relationship? It implies a variety of things. For one thing, non-discrimination. I can't discriminate on the basis of race, class, sex, all sorts of things, really, that might be irrelevant to the performance of the job. There are things under the law called bona fide occupational qualifications, which actually are exceptions to this. If I am hiring actors to play Martin Luther King Jr., for example. I don't have to interview young Asian women, let's say. And so that's something that, but look, that's rare, okay? Ordinarily, those things are irrelevant. I can discriminate only on the basis of things that are relevant to doing the job. And so I can't discriminate on the basis of any of those suspect classifications, but I can't discriminate on the basis of personal friendship, on the basis of whether somebody is from my hometown, whether they like the same sports team I do, etc., etc., etc. I've got to apply the same standards to everyone. And the same is true once they work for the company. I've got to treat everybody the same way. I can't have one set of rules for my friends and another set of rules for my enemies. I've got to apply the same rules, the same criteria to everyone. But it's not just a question of applying the same rules. That's the point of Kant's response to, in effect, what he already perceived some years before as the possibility of something like Hegel's critique. No, this implies that I have to respect everyone. So as an employer, I have to respect my employees. I have to treat them the way, maybe not that I would like myself to be treated, but at least in a way that shows respect for them, that respects their autonomy, that respects their agency. And that kind of issue is subtle. What does it mean to respect your employees? In part, it means delegating what you ought to delegate. In part, it means treating them as equals, as fellow human beings, rather than as mere underlings. Means not merely using them, not exploiting them, not doing things that you would not want your superior to do to you in similar circumstances. Well, it also implies that employees have a responsibility to respect the employer. And that means, too, follow reasonable rules, for example, that the employer has established. It may mean treating customers, co-workers, the employer with respect. So this is something that runs all throughout these business relationships. It's not specific to an employer-employee relationship. It has to do with the peer relationships within the company, to people outside the company, and so on. These are universal laws. And that brings me to something important about the nature of rights from a Kantian point of view. These are based on universal considerations. They are things that are maxims we would apply as a universal law, even a universal law of nature that cannot possibly be broken. What that means is that there are no situations where these rights have to yield to something else. In a Kantian framework, rights truly are trumps. They trump every other moral consideration. You can't say, well, yes, I know that's a violation of a right, but gosh, it really pays off big for the company, or I'll be way better off if I get to violate that person's rights. You still can't do it. It is always morally unacceptable. So Ross's perspective in common sense ethics is that rights are very important considerations, but there can be circumstances in which they are overridden by other more important moral considerations. In a Kantian framework, that simply cannot happen. If you have a right to something because it's been promised to you, for example, that must be given to you. If not, you must be compensated. It is not something that can be overridden by some other kind of consideration. And the same thing is true of any other Kantian right. You are always to be shown respect. You are never to be exploited. And it doesn't matter how big the payoff to anyone would be if you are used as a mere means. Can't be done. There's a final version of the Kantian imperative that I want to mention because I think it is relevant in this context. Kant talks about the formula of the kingdom of ends. He says, imagine a systematic union of ends where we had a group of people who were all treating one another with mutual respect. We're all respecting one another's autonomy. We're applying to themselves the rules they would apply to everyone, and conversely, so they act as if they were legislating members of that kingdom of ends. That's what an ideal company ought to be like. Everyone ought to be cooperating toward the same end within the company. It doesn't mean everybody has to share exactly the same ends. It's still okay for you to love playing softball when you're after hours, and somebody else to enjoy poker, and someone else to just like to go home and play with the kids in the backyard. All of that's fine. It's that within the company there are shared ends, and you all share those ends, and among those ends, of course, are rationality. So part of this is you all value each other's rational natures. You've got a kind of utopian situation. Well, of course, no real-world organization, even a close-knit family, is exactly like that. But Kant says that's the ideal. That's what we should be striving for. And when we think about the values, the rules that ought to govern our company, we should have that in mind. We want a company with a systematic union of ends where everyone values everyone else's rational agency, where everyone values other people as ends in themselves rather than as means only. And that's an important moral ideal for us to shoot for. Think about our responsibilities, think about our rights in connection with that ideal, even if it's not something we have now or ever can practically attain within the limits of this world. It's something that serves as a regulative ideal toward which we ought to be striving. That's what we really want to attain in the end.